We're back, and you can see the magic happen in the background. And we have these three amazing speakers today with us. So we have Liz Selman from the School of Life. Liz, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Hi everyone, I'm Liz Selman from the School of Life. I'm the Global Instructional Design Lead, and it's a pleasure to be here today speaking with you about trust.
Wonderful. Vicky?
Hi, I'm Vicky Lim. I'm Head of People Communications at TomTom, which looks after our internal comms and employer brand sides of the team. It's really exciting to be here, and it's a topic I'm super passionate about, so thanks for the opportunity.
Wonderful. And then Thomas.
Hi everybody, I'm Thomas. I have the pleasure of leading professional services at Slack. It's very nice to be here today. I love this topic as well. I'm honored actually to speak on it. I feel very passionately about it, so thank you.
Wonderful. So to actually begin our panel, we have another polling question for you, our audience, and it is a tricky one. And we were all four of us were very curious. Do you believe that trust should be earned or given? And I'm also curious to hear what our panelists think about that. Thomas, do you have any thoughts?
I do, and it's really interesting to watch the live answers come back. I personally feel that trust needs to be earned, whether it's in the professional life or in your personal life. Trust is all the same thing, at least from my perspective. And even though I'll always go into every situation with, giving people, the benefit of the doubt, I think, as Joe put out a little bit earlier, it can be just lost in a second. And so it's a very precious thing, and it needs to be earned, and it needs to be worked on and focused on.
And Vicky and Liz, any thoughts on what our audience said? It's quite a split, but maybe not such a stark contrast that what I was personally thinking it would be.
I think it's interesting the amount that we've got in the given space, and it speaks to that idea that I think Thomas is absolutely right. Trust does need to be earned, but at the same time, we need to be open and receptive to giving trust as well, and sort of giving people that opportunity to build it with us and be open in that way.
And I wonder if there's a difference in qualities of trust as well. So when you first meet someone and you give them trust, then it makes it very easy to build on that. But also, if someone earns your trust, then that trust maybe goes deeper, and you can rely on it more, and it's less likely to be damaged quickly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. And now I would just like to go maybe back in time and actually ask Liz to tell us, how has the workplace evolved, and why do we talk about trust? Like, is it something that people always cared about? Is it new? Can you tell us more?
Yeah, of course. I think it's really interesting to think about the context of work and actually acknowledge that our experience of work is probably much more unique than we give it credit for. So if we think back 100 years ago even, and certainly more time before that, work was not an arena where trust was built. Work was not an arena where we made friendships or thought about professional development. Work was kind of a necessary evil for most of us. And now, obviously, after even just the last century, there's been a huge transition in the way we work. And I think a really big part of that transition has been, for most of us at least, moving from a physical work environment to a more mental and cognitively engaged one. And when we have more cognitively engaged work environments, we expect different things from work. We're psychologically engaged. We expect to be more content from our workplaces. We expect higher levels of fulfillment as well. And that means that things like trust, things like connection at work start to become really important. And I think the challenge is that obviously in the last 100 years this has happened and our expectations of work have evolved. But as leaders, we're not often taught that much about trust. We're still leaning towards the harder skills, the technical skills. How do we learn? Where do we learn to kind of build trust in the workplace? So I think that's the challenge that we've got at the moment with those evolving expectations.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And alongside the workplace, leaders had to evolve as well. So Vicky, what are your thoughts on the role of leaders in this new era?
Yeah, well, as Liz says, everything has evolved so quickly, and I think our views of leadership have also changed in that time. So I think, leaders were traditionally seen as people who could command and control, maybe the foreman of a factory who could stand there and give orders, and those were sort of the expectations. And maybe that leader had to seem quite invulnerable and very much in control all the time in order to maintain that persona. Whereas, especially with catalysts like the pandemic, these days people have very different expectations, and we went from a leader who maybe needed to stand on a stage and tell everyone what was going on to someone who needed to stand beside you and be a lot more human. And that's quite a shift for people to make as well, from needing to kind of put on your business face all the time to being someone who has to be comfortable with, having a kid in the background or a cat wandering across your screen on a Zoom call. But where leaders can show that human side and people expect to see more of that authenticity, they have the opportunity to build a lot more trust because people can connect with them better, people can build relationships with them better.
Wonderful. And then, Thomas, I have a tricky question for you, because what Neil said in the keynote was that trust is often not talked about because it's something soft, it's something fluffy, like how do you even touch it? But Slack has actually revealed that you can touch it, and in fact, it's the key driver of productivity. So what are your thoughts on that?
I think, Neil did a great job bringing out the main points that the Slack survey or Slack study brought together. And it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that trust, a trusting employee leads to 2 times higher rate of productivity. I think there's this sort of thing that happens at a workplace, especially when the trust isn't there or the workplace is trying to become a trustful place, where people are embarrassed or they're shy to be vulnerable, or they're afraid to sort of be themselves. And so I think whether, one thing that I've always talked about with my teams, whether you're a leader, you're a manager, or you're a team member, leadership transcends all roles. And it's very important for everybody to take a responsibility in this, to sort of break that feeling that it's not cool to talk about things that are real as a human, as a person. And so what I tried to do at work, especially, on my first day at Slack, I told my team how nervous I was to be meeting with everybody. And I think they had this anticipation, expectation that I'd be on top of everything. But it just really brought the human element to it. And I think it allows other people to feel the permission to be human as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing. And then also, as Neil mentioned, there are a lot of blockers and barriers to trust building, and many people just don't prioritize that. So what would be your advice as leaders? Like, how can we help other leaders break down those barriers, especially in this hybrid world? What would be your tips? And Liz, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, of course. I think one thing, and it's a really simple thing that we can resolve, is often there is a lack of clear expectations in our workplaces. I think as leaders, often we can just assume that people may sometimes almost read our minds in terms of what we want from them and the expectations that we have. And we can also, when that happens and they don't meet our expectations, we can become incredibly disappointed with them. And on the flip side of that, you've got the kind of micromanaging piece as well. So when we are hyper aware of what we want people to achieve and we're all over their desks all of the time. So I think it's really important to strike that balance as a leader and just really take the time to set those clear expectations. What do you want from people in their roles? What do you want them to achieve? What does that look like? What does excellent look like as well? Mm-hmm. And just making that really tangible for people can really help to build trust.
Oh, that's a great point. Thank you. Vicky?
Yeah, that's a really, really good one. And yeah, definitely something that as a leader I want to focus on. I think for me there's 2 things that can really help. The first is listening. So showing openness to what your team is saying, really trying to understand that and empathize with that. That's really crucial because I think that helps them understand that you care and that you want their trust and that you are willing to earn that. And then the second is sort of being vulnerable and showing that trust. So, as Thomas said, being really honest about who you are and how you're feeling. As Joe said earlier, being honest if you're not sure about something and telling people what you can when you can. So being open and transparent and putting that above maybe your own comfort zone or your own feelings of security about things that you can and can't say.
Mm-hmm.
good answers, and I think I'll build on both of those. The first one, I think, in terms of a barrier, it's this assumption and this feeling of the hierarchy at the organization. And with hierarchy comes this implication of authority. And regardless of where you are, whether you're a director, a manager, vice president, executive, everybody makes assumptions about the humans that are behind the roles above it. So an interesting thing came out of the keynote I saw from the feedback of, how do you provide feedback to a manager that you don't necessarily trust? And I think Neil made a really good point. You need to be very careful, but it's really important that you do this. And because what surprised me in my journey, and I've worked at various different places, is people respond and they will surprise you. I genuinely believe that everybody's trying to do good. Everybody's a good person, and everybody will respond to that if you come to them in a vulnerable and constructive way about it. So that's what I would add.
I love that. Yeah. So funny that you say, because that's one of our key sayings inside Slido is like, remember, even if you are frustrated, like there are only good people within this environment. And oftentimes I feel like that's something we need to remind ourselves as well. Wonderful. Another tricky question. So we were talking about, I'm full of tricky questions today. But we were talking about the role of the top exec, right? Like they're the ones who clearly set the tone and set the culture. But even as the middle managers, we still can do something and we can break that chain and we can shield people, we can talk to them. What are your tips? How can we become the chain breakers, even in an environment that is not maybe nurturing? Yeah. Thomas, would you like to start? Yeah.
Another great question. And I think it's really important when you're in middle management, I'm in middle management, that you really take ownership of this problem or this challenge and don't dismiss it. We talked about the importance of taking that leap forward and doing that constructive feedback upwards, but for your team and the people around you, and it doesn't even need to be your direct team, it's anybody and everybody in the organization, is being available for them. And what that means is, and some of the best mentorship I ever received was, in my strategic plan for the year, make sure I have enough time to think. And thinking involves talking with people, because that really helps me learn and understand. And so what that means in reality, though, is when somebody wants to talk, be available, be present, and really understand them as a person, understand who they are, and what they're scared about is usually what I'm thinking about, because it's the fear which will really help describe the behavior and the challenge itself. So be available.
Be available. Vicky, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'd build on that slightly. So as part of that availability, I think really make an effort to acknowledge and validate, because I think people who are feeling like they're in a low trust environment really need to understand that it's okay to feel that way. And then you can empathize and think about how you can support them through that, and what you can do to change the culture above you as well as the culture below you. So I think, making sure that you're giving that feedback and you're listening to them, and you're also helping them accept and feel accepted.
Mm-hmm. And I guess maybe just to speak to a reason why as leaders we may not make ourselves available, I think sometimes as leaders we can put ourselves under lots of pressure to be this sort of all-knowing, all-seeing entity all of the time, to be the experts in the organisation. And especially if you're new to leadership or new to management, that's kind of a self-imposed pressure to be the expert. And I guess ironically, when we put ourselves as leaders in that position, our curiosity really shrinks back. It's quite vulnerable to be curious as leaders. So when we can almost embrace that vulnerability, ask those questions of people, make ourselves available. At the School of Life, we talk about the art of humble inquiry. So just sitting down with people and asking them, what's going on for you at the moment? What are the challenges that you're facing and how can I help? I think that can be really powerful if we can push through that thinking pattern.
I love that, because we were just joking, like many leaders, they ask at the beginning of a call, like, okay, how was your weekend? Or how are you today? But it's almost like a greeting, like, you need to show that you care and you need to follow up with an answer, because if you just brush it off, then you don't get that connection with people, right?
That's it. I just, if it's okay, building off
Please,
of
yeah.
what Liz said, I find myself, and probably likewise for you both, that sometimes the teams that you lead expect you to know all the answers, especially when times are tough and there's ambiguity with managing, leading through the pandemic, post-pandemic, through tech. We all know a little bit about that. We don't know all the answers, and it's impossible to know all the answers. And so if you're in that situation, having that conversation, I think it's very important to do exactly what Liz has just described, and that is get yourself out of that situation by being completely vulnerable and open and saying, I'm with you, I'm scared too, but my commitment to you is to be as transparent as I possibly can about all the information, and then trust people with the information that you have. Everybody's an adult, doesn't matter where you are in the organization, but that really helps to build a stronger feeling amongst the team.
Love it. Thank you. And speaking about transparency, I actually launched another polling question for our audience that we can see here on the screen, which touches on the topic of office gossip. So we were curious to know how many of you are experiencing office gossip, so private conversations with your teammates that you don't really share with relevant people or teams. So look at the winning answer, which is quite frequently on a weekly basis. So Liz, I know that this is a topic you're passionate about. So what are your thoughts? Like Neil already mentioned the horrendous story of burnout and cynicism and fear, but it could also demonstrate in the smaller ways, like an innocent little chat or gossip. So what is your view on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the School of Life, we are fascinated by office gossip as a phenomena at work. And I think the challenge is not so much that it happens, is that we don't pay enough attention as to why it happens and what's going on in the organisation. So we can see really clearly here that quite frequently on a weekly basis, 47% of us on this call right now engage in office gossip. We don't gossip in the office to solve problems or take action. We gossip out of frustration, out of annoyance, almost in a recognition that we can't change a situation. Gossip in a way is quite soothing for us. It can help to share those views, but we know that those views aren't really going anywhere. So we can think of office gossip almost like this ball of energy, and this ball of energy contains insights and feedback and perspectives that actually as leaders could be really useful to us, but it's got nowhere to go. So it's going to bounce around from you to me and back to Thomas and back to you, and it's just going to get stuck between us. So a really nice way and a really effective way that we can open up that gossip and make those insights more useful is to make sure that there are channels for that feedback. So making sure that there are safe channels for that feedback, and making sure that when people in the organisation submit that feedback and those ideas and perspectives, they know something's going to be done about it. It's going to be actioned and it's going to be heard. I think that's really the effective way around things like office gossip.
I love the answer, and I have to be really honest, I never thought about the positive spin to that, so that's a wonderful realization. And speaking about the bad guys in this situation and the low moments that we also go through in our lives, Vicky, you have a wonderful example of how building trust proactively can actually really pay off. So would you be happy to share an example from your company, TomTom?
Sure. So I think at TomTom we're partly lucky, but I think also there's been a lot of hard work to build trust within the organisation. And we had a really difficult situation earlier this year where we experienced a data breach. So one of our IT suppliers was hacked, and I think about 15,000 companies were affected, and about 60 million individuals had their private data accessed as part of that. And unfortunately, TomTom acted quickly to resolve it, but some of our data was lost. And that data included personal data of our employees. So dreadful situation, not a place you ever want to find yourself in, but a really important one to react as positively to as possible. So we immediately realized that we needed to keep our people informed. We needed to be very transparent about what happened. And we also needed to create as much discourse and interaction around this as possible, because people would have those feelings of frustration and concern and anxiety that we needed to understand and be able to address. So we set up an AMA very quickly. We had our leaders stand there, explain what had happened, everything we knew, everything we were working on, all the things we were trying to do to support them. And then we asked people for their questions, and it was very challenging. It was one of the most difficult AMAs that I've been in. People were rightfully quite concerned. The way we run Slidos at TomTom is we always have them unmoderated, but we always have names showing. And the way that we see it is that people can say anything that they want, but they would have to be proud enough to put their name on it. And that, I think, keeps discourse open, but quite respectful. And it definitely doesn't stop the challenging questions, which is good. And we've done this for many years. So I think there's a lot of psychological safety in that people know that they can ask those questions. And also our leaders, it's never an easy position to put themselves in, to be in the hot seat when there's emotions running high. But to their credit, they do it, and they take it on the chin, and they respond in the best way that they can. And they've seen the benefits of that as well. They won't always have the answers. They won't always have the right answers either. But they put themselves through it, and they accept that it's a really important part of maintaining that trust in the organisation. So for us, this was a moment where trust had been broken in some ways, but we had to rely on the trust that we had built up, and the way that people perceived the fact that the leadership were there to support them and cared about the impact on them and was listening to what their concerns were. So we got very useful feedback from that. We acted very quickly. We managed to set up another 15 AMAs in the space of a week, one per country, because we realized that's what people needed. We also got consultants in who could provide more tailored advice. We shared that with our teams. And it was a lot. It was very stressful. I think we had an FAQ document that was about 19 pages by the end. And I know far more about cybersecurity than I ever wanted to. And about people's very strong feelings around it as well, which are understandable. But a real big win for us was that, we held our Glint Pulse survey a month ago, so about 6 months after the breach. And we were expecting it to be something that people were still, quite top of mind, quite upset about. But actually only 5 people mentioned it out of a population of about 3,500. 2 of them wanted a more detailed post-mortem, which I think is our software engineering population. One of them was saying that it had taken a lot of his personal time to protect himself, which was a fair comment. But then the other 2 were saying that actually the response was really positive, and they appreciated how quickly it had done, the support that had been put in place. And so for us, it's a great example that, providing that outlet, giving people support and space, giving them the reassurance, and building on that trust that we had and trying to repair the trust that had been broken, could turn what was quite a negative experience into one that was at the very least neutral, and in some cases even positive.
Yeah. And I love that example, because I'm pretty sure, even though I wasn't a part of that, but if you wouldn't have had that Q&A or Ask Me Anything, then the feedback in the surveys would be probably more
100%.
negative.
Yeah,
right.
definitely.
And that ties back to the keynote, that showing up matters, right? And having that open platform matters. So with that being said, we have time for Q&A, and I can see there's a lot of questions in Slido. And I would just like our audience, please feel free to have a look at them and upvote the ones that you like the most, because I'm going to be taking those accordingly. But there was a question actually from Emma, and it ties back to what you were just saying, Vicky. And I don't know if you want to sum it up in some keywords, but if a particular incident damages trust in a team or a company, how do leaders go about rebuilding it? And of course, Thomas and Liz, if there's anything you'd like to add, feel free.
Yeah, so like I say, I think accountability is really important. So first of all, recognizing that trust is broken and acknowledging that, and being vulnerable enough to say, I think we've messed up here, or there's a problem here, and then taking accountability. That can be really, really important. I think if someone stands there and says, I made a mistake, or we made a mistake, or there's things we could have done better, that's really crucial, because people then feel heard. They feel like someone's willing to take action on it as well. And then, putting your money where your mouth is, and very quickly going about showing tangible actions, not just talking about it, but also, putting effort into resolving it. I think those things can be a real turnaround.
Thomas, any thoughts?
That's a great answer. It honestly is. I'm thinking back to a time a few years ago where a redundancy hit where I was working, and I didn't see it coming. And that's an awful situation to be in when you have a team and you have a trusting relationship. And I thought long and hard about, how do I show up the next day and the next week on that? And I followed my heart with it. And it's pretty much to Vicky's guidance there, where I showed up and I was honest. I think people expected me to know that this was happening, and it really worried them that I didn't know, because where's that sense of control? But I was honest about it. I took ownership of it, and I also made commitments to them about what I would do to better network into the organization, to have better insight into the weather that was coming. Because I took that on myself as a personal development item rather than pointing the finger and blaming other people. Rebounding from that situation and rebuilding the trust, it takes time. It doesn't happen in a meeting. It didn't happen after that meeting. It happens every day, in every interaction, in every moment. And when you say you care, you genuinely need to care. When you're talking about someone's family or someone's problems that they're having, you really need to invest in that and really be there for those folks. And so it's incremental steps of building it back, but these things don't happen overnight. When you build it the right way, that trust can help you through your next storm, for sure.
Thank you. And Liz, any perspective?
I mean, amazing answers and amazing examples. And I think what both of your examples demonstrate is that there are always going to be curveballs to trust. There are always going to be external elements, data breaches, etc., that come out of the blue. And those elements don't necessarily need to cause cultures of fear and cynicism and what we've been talking about. It's how you deal with them that really matters and really helps. So when you deal with them effectively, when you bring that accountability, that vulnerability, the listening, it never needs to get to that place of fear and cynicism. You can contain it really safely in that space.
I wonder, there's a question, an anonymous question from our audience, which is about, do we have any tips on quick wins, how to build trust? I often work in fixed term contracts, so need to build trust fast with peers and those who I manage. So is there a shortcut to trust, or if you have limited time, is there anything you can do to build that connection at least?
I'll take a stab at it first.
Yeah.
That's okay. I think people trust the network that you come from. And I think that's like more of a thing that is outside of work as well. It's like the group of friends that you hang out with. If you're meeting someone new and that new person knows your group of friends and they know they're good people, then they're going to often give you the benefit of the doubt. I think that transcends into the professional world as well. However, I'll come back and say it's a tricky thing. It's not tricky, it's the wrong word. Trust takes time. It's something that you need to build, and it happens slowly. And you got to think about how every single person you're interacting with has grown up in their own life and what trust means to them. It doesn't work on the same pace for everybody. It's not the same thing for everyone. So incremental steps is the best path forward.
And Liz, do you maybe have any exercises or any activities for the teams? How can they build trust?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a number of different ways and different approaches that we can do that. But a quick win, we mentioned it earlier, is really just about making yourself available for people. So setting time in your space, in your day-to-day. It can be really tempting, especially when you're on fixed-term contracts, to just get stuck into work all of the time. But making yourself available in that way is really important. So I would say that. Also, I would bring back the art of humble inquiry as well. So making time to ask questions, ask those sort of silly questions that no one wants to ask, and really just engage in that way. Can really help just show your own authenticity and your willingness to learn.
Mm-hmm. And then Vicky, you're working remotely while most of your team is in Amsterdam. So what would you say, working in internal comms, what are the tips how to bring people together and build trust?
I think definitely I liked the comment earlier from someone about over communicating. I think that's really important. I think I spend a lot more time meeting with my team virtually than I would necessarily do if we were in the office together, because I know I have to compensate for the fact that, I don't see them physically every day. I don't have a chat with them as we go and get coffee. And I also try and really make the moments that we do have physically together count. So when I'm over there, we always have time for a team drink or a team lunch, and I always make sure that, we go and have coffee with the ones that I don't necessarily see as often. And I think those kind of moments that you can use to rebuild relationships or rebuild trust and give yourself a store to rely on and to build on digitally is really, really helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you. So looking at the next questions, and again, I would just like our audience, I would just like to encourage you to upvote the questions that you like the most or post new ones. So there's a question about how do you keep the culture strong, especially if the teams are growing? And I think, Thomas, this is something that we have in common because we have been acquired recently, 2 years ago. Also, Slack went through the acquisition, like their team's growing and changing. So how in this new environment of growth can you actually keep trust going?
So I think the example I'm going to speak about actually to this one is my time at Oracle. With Slack and Salesforce, both companies are so founded on the values. And where I think both organizations are quite fortunate, those values fold over each other. They're very much the same. That's not to say that there's bumps and bruises along the way. But Oracle provided a much more challenging example of this. When I started there, I was acquired into Oracle with a marketing automation platform some of you might know called Eloqua. And this is when Oracle started to build the Marketing Cloud. So there were 6 acquisitions after me, and I had the opportunity of building that team. So looking back on that, because I didn't really know what I was doing while I was doing it. Again, I was following my heart, my intuition, and had some great mentors around me inside and outside of work, was creating a nucleus of a culture based on value and vision. So what do you stand for, and what does the future look like? And you don't, as a leader, you don't always know what the future looks like, but I do believe it's our responsibility to have the narrative that we believe in. So even if we're 80% right, that's a great job. And it was that narrative, it was that vision, it was those values that worked as the fundamental principles for the team. So as new folks were coming in, joining, moving around, it started small, but it was like a fire. People wanted to join it. It was the good place to be. It felt good. And that's how we did it. And I'd say at Slack and Salesforce, much further ahead on the curve than that experience. Yeah.
And Vicky, how do you keep going?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good example, and I like the idea of a fire where people naturally gravitate towards. I think for my team, something I find really, really useful is to be very conscious about the connections that we have. So if we have a strong team culture, let the team be the champions of that, and not just me. So we do a lot of buddying, we do a lot of partnering on projects that you might not otherwise work on, and then finding people's strengths as well and letting them kind of peer mentor each other. And I think the more connections you can bring, the easier it is to bring people in, and the faster that they adopt and add to your culture.
And then Liz, when we were speaking earlier, also said that School of Life had a massive growth when it comes to people joining your team. So how do you also go about it? Like, do you internally play some of the School of Life cards or games?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean that's really important. And actually that's a really good example of making that culture tangible where you can. I think when you have a strong team culture, it's incredible when you're in it. It's also quite important to recognise that can be quite vulnerable at times. That culture won't always be there unless you nurture it and unless you make it tangible. So we're working with organisations at the moment, sort of global organisations that have whole sort of internal universities dedicated to their culture and what it means to work in that organisation. I love that idea that you can kind of learn about culture in a really tangible way.
Yeah, I love it. And I also have to share a story. Like last week, we had our exec here in London, and we were playing one of your card games. And actually, you know, I think at the beginning, people are like, okay, what am I going to share? But like you can just see in that moment, like when you just keep building it on that connection, how people keep opening up, and you learn so much about each other. And those social elements are like so invaluable to building that trust for sure. Wonderful. So let's take a look at some of the other questions that are coming through. All right. Speaking about tricky being one of our keywords today, there's a question, how do you build trust with an employee who constantly breaches your trust or has a less than stellar track record?
Yeah.
So a tough one.
I give it a go.
Yes?
That's okay. Yeah. Give you some time to think. So when in this type of situation that I think many of us have is a great question that many of us have experienced. The place I always go is to the person, and I think there's something wrong in this person's life. And what is it? Because there's things that happen at work which are, frustrating and, just make you want to scream sometimes. At the same time, this type of repetitive relationship and behavior, there's something at the source. And so what I've done is I've gone in deep, but at the same time, being very careful with the boundaries around sort of mental health or other issues that might be there. But if I identify something like that at the core, I try to use a network around me to help that person connect with the right professionals or the places of help that they need. If it's something that they're just really frustrated with their job and they're just really tired and they need to go, I help that person exit the business in a constructive way. But like an image that I always think about, I love plants. And I often think sometimes when you have like a wilting plant at home, often if you put that plant into new soil, you give it some plant food and you find the right place in your home, inside or outside, within weeks that plant could be flourishing again. And I really think the same applies to people in a little bit more of a complex way, but I like that analogy a lot.
And I guess maybe a school of life approach to this. I mean, we talk a lot about self-awareness. So in that situation where you've got an employee who seems to be sort of consistently breaking your trust, I would really encourage you as a leader to think about your own sort of self first and your own actions and expectations. So we spoke earlier about clarity of expectations. Are you 100% sure that your expectations have been really clear, really tangible for that employee? And also, I think the classic one here, how brave and bold and radical have you been with the feedback that you've provided as well? Does that employee know of every instance where you've sort of maybe kept it in and kept that internal frustration, that breach of trust? Have you been able to be sort of authentic in providing that constructive feedback for that employee in order for them to learn and grow and to progress in that sense?
Yeah.
That's a great answer.
I think that radical honesty is a really tough one because often as leaders we want to kind of protect people or we want people to kind of get along and it's not always easy to challenge ourselves to give that perspective. But when we do, that's the only way that you can help implement change or you can understand really what's going on is sort of tackling things and really understanding them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Vicky, like keeping you in the hot seat, there's actually a very interesting and little bit provocative question because the question goes like this. We used to do live Q&A sessions with anonymity to ask questions, but now anonymity has been removed. And we can see we are not getting as many questions then. Is anonymity a better idea? And just to add to this, I find it really interesting because at Slido, I usually moderate our all hands. And even though I would say we have a very open culture, most people choose to be anonymous. And looking at the people here, most people choose to be anonymous. So what are your thoughts on anonymity versus transparency?
It's very interesting. So I've been in businesses that do it different ways. I think people feel safer with anonymity. There's no doubt around that. And so there's kind of a default psychological safety to anonymity. Whereas if you want names and you ask people to put names, then you have to build the psychological safety for them to feel comfortable doing that. And I was lucky when I joined TomTom, they'd been doing this for a while. And so there was a really clear, people have asked some challenging questions, they're still in the business and doing well. And I think that took a little bit of time to build. So I would say, persevere. You could even do a little bit of cheating and field some questions that are challenging. So if everyone's thinking this and you're aware of that from the office gossip, get someone to put it in and then answer it honestly and approachably. And also, prepare your leaders to deal with those questions in a way that is accessible and empathetic, and don't shut down the difficult questions. But I think it is really valuable when we do it this way because, we then don't need to moderate. We do see that the tone is respectful. And I have had, on the flip side, anonymous questions that, people have a lot of emotions and it can be used in a way that is a bit damaging to the conversation. So I think it depends on what works in your environment, but I think it is possible to get to a place where people do feel safe to put their name. And I think it creates accountability that goes both ways. So our leaders really like that we have an anonymity off, and that makes them comfortable to put themselves in situations where they are on the hot seat and taking those difficult conversations. So it builds in both directions.
Liz and Thomas, any thoughts on anonymity within your companies?
I just learned something from you, so that was great. I think I'll just say, joining Slack and seeing how Slack use Slack, and this isn't a pitch for Slack, but it was just completely eye-opening in terms of how transparent all the feedback and all the interaction is in there. I really believe that anonymous messages is a symbol that trust isn't there. I mean, someone's worried about the reaction to the question, or they feel shy or whatever it might be. And so I definitely think that I agree with everything that Vicky said. I'm not going to repeat it. Yeah.
Liz, any thoughts on this?
We talked earlier about those establishing those feedback channels just generally across organisations, and I've certainly worked in organisations before where we've had anonymous polls, anonymous Q&As, and things have got pretty messy quite quickly. And I think in my experience that can happen when those live Q&As are the only touch point to provide feedback, the only way to get sort of directly to managers or directly to leaders in that sense. And I think when middle managers take a little bit more responsibility for those day-to-day feedback channels, you don't get those situations where you have anonymous questions and people are almost already boiling over before they've asked the questions. So I would just say, think about the feedback channels outside of those live Q&As, and that might help those run smoother.
And before we actually get to the final moments of our panel and our key takeaways, I would just like to build on what you said, because somebody's asking, how do you get to a high trust environment when there's a lack of communication? So we learned that yes, Q&A is important, yes, you should do it, yes, you should be vulnerable, but it shouldn't be the only avenue. So what are the other ways how we can communicate, especially if there isn't that level of communication? And Vicky, as a head of communication, what would be your thoughts?
Well, I really like the democratization of communication. So when we think of communication, we often think top down, we think leaders talking to people, and I think that's super important. But I think what Slido does, and also what Slack does really well, is democratize the conversation. And so it takes the pressure off leaders, or in some ways it kind of shifts the emphasis on them, but it allows people to build trust amongst each other. And I think if people show up on those platforms very authentically and they interact in a much more, day-to-day way, both on a social and a professional level, that can really help, and that can be a great way of kind of like rocket boosting the trust and connection in a team.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
Yeah, I'd add that I think back to the pandemic days when we were all sitting in whatever room you were in your flat or your apartment or your house, and everybody was remote and isolated. I think the key ingredient, or one of the key ingredients, was just finding a way to have fun and being playful. everybody wants to have fun, and I have a really good friend that constantly reminds me of that. Where is fun in your calendar this week? And I think about that with a team, and there's so many great ideas of activities and you could do, but it brings on a vulnerability. People can come back outside of their work mode, and part of their playful youth comes to the table, and it really helps build that trust amongst the team.
Mm-hmm. I guess from my perspective, if you're finding that there is that general lack of communication at the moment in your virtual teams or hybrid teams, think about the ways that you could, at least in the short term, better scaffold that communication. And that might feel a little bit artificial at first, kind of putting 10 minutes in before meetings or half an hour lunch break to just kind of grab a cup of coffee together. But with those scaffolding moments in place, you'll find, I think, after kind of weeks and months, that actually that comes more naturally. But I think people do need support. They need that structure in place, but trust that structure will make an impact, and that can fall away gradually once people get into more of a rhythm and more of an open channel of communication.
Wonderful. Thank you. And so I know we have just 2 minutes left. So first I want to just give a little reminder that there's a masterclass after this. So if you want to get some practical tips, do stick around with the live stream. And before we let you go, I would just love to really close this panel off with a key message or a key takeaway to our audience. And as you can see on the screen, we're asking our audience for their key takeaways, which I'll reveal after you share it first. So maybe, Liz, would you be happy to start?
Yeah, of course. There's a quote that really resonates with me, and it's by Edmund Lockhart, who actually has nothing to do with business or psychological safety or trust. He's a pioneer of forensic science from the 19th century. And he said, every contact leaves a trace. And I think that's so applicable to our workplaces and to how we think about trust. So I think my top recommendation would be, as leaders, we so often think about trust and building trust in these big moments, big presentations, big events, or the big ways that we respond to change. But think about those millions of contactable, traceable moments that you spend every single day, and think about what you do consistently to set expectations as a leader, and also to make sure that people know what they can expect from you as well. I think that would be my top tip, is the million of tiny moments.
Love that quote. Thank you. Vicky?
I think for me, it would be maybe be willing to stretch your comfort zone and to step out of it even. Because we talked about vulnerability, we talked about making yourself accessible, we talked about taking accountability, and all of that takes challenging yourself. And I think if you and the people around you can see that you're challenging yourself and you're putting yourself out there in order to try and win their trust, that's a really great way of indicating that you care about it and that you are someone who can be trustworthy for them.
I'd probably leave you all with, think about a concept called the heliotropic effect, and that is basically all living things lean to the light. So regardless of where you are in the organization, we're all leaders. So be that change for the people around you, take the plunge, and have the courage to do it.
And now with that, let's take a look at what our audience had said. So in the middle, we have building trust takes effort, followed by building trust is not easy, but it is achievable. We also have authenticity and vulnerability can create a safe environment. So anything that speaks to you from this very complex work cloud. And thank you so much for sharing all your learnings. I love to see those. So yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate your time. I really want to thank Liz, Vicky, and Thomas joining us on this journey. And yeah, as mentioned before, feel free to stick around for the masterclass if you want to get practical. And don't worry, all the slides, all the materials, and all the recordings will get to your inbox soon, so you can rewatch all these wonderful tips. Thank you all so much, and wish you a wonderful day or evening wherever you are. Bye.